we're going to be talking about the role of the Islamic world in the period from about 900 to about 1450. So we'll be including some earlier years in this one, just because we need to get some background on this, right? Because there's actually a lot of stuff happening in the Islamic world before the year 1200, right? So we want to pull that in as well, so we have that context, right? And there's a couple of things we want to look for here. One is, by the time period we're looking at, 1200 to 1450, you already have a massive expansion of Islam into the world, okay? So we want to kind of take a look at how that happened, right? What does that look like, okay? And then secondly, as Islam is expanding into these different regions of the world, they're not just bringing Islam with them, okay? They're bringing other forms of knowledge too that will be applied to this Islamic world, to create kind of a coherent whole throughout the Islamic world system, okay? Something that's recognizable kind of no matter where you're at in the Islamic world, okay? So again, the two things we want to look at: spread of Islam and what else are they bringing with them, right? Because it's not just the religion, there's other things being transferred as well, okay? Now, if we're going to start looking at the expansion of Islam, obviously we need to start with the beginnings, right? With the Prophet Muhammad himself, okay? Now, most of this is taking place in the Arabian Peninsula. Muhammad, the prophet, is from Mecca, okay? And this is where he has his revelations, okay? So if you take a text like the Quran, for example, the holy book of Islam, those are the revelations from God to Muhammad, okay? And something that's quite important that we need to point out is, unlike Christianity, for example, Muhammad is not considered a god, right? He's not to be worshipped. That's why he's called the Prophet Muhammad, right? He's the messenger of God, okay? And according to the Quran, this happens through an angel, essentially, Gabriel, who is bringing the word of God to Muhammad, okay? And like I said, this will be compiled into the holiest book of Islam, the Quran, okay? Now, during his lifetime, as he is converting his family, his neighbors, etc., to Islam, this is where we see that first expansion, right? It kind of flows out from himself, okay? Eventually, most of the Arabian Peninsula will be brought under Islam during Muhammad's lifetime, okay? Now, after the Prophet passes, we actually have a little bit of a schism here, okay, over who's going to be the successor to Muhammad, okay? And you may have heard of Sunni and Shia Islam. That's where that comes out of, right? It's this dispute over who's going to take charge of Islam after the death of the Prophet, okay? And the victor in that struggle is what will become known as the Umayyad dynasty, right? These are Sunni Muslims who basically take political control of the Islamic world at this time, okay? The Shia Muslims will kind of be pushed to the side, right? Marginalized, okay? As not being true to the faith, so to speak, okay? From the Umayyad Empire, we'll transition into the Abbasid Empire, right? So these are these two early dynasties of Islam, right? The kind of political formation of Islam is within these two early dynasties, okay? And if you take them together, you've got a period from about the 8th century all the way up until the 1200s, when you have a Mongol invasion of the Middle East, okay? Now, looking at this dispute between Sunni and Shia for a second, we don't want to say that the Shia are necessarily completely marginalized, because that's not true, right? In fact, during the Abbasid dynasty, you have this very powerful group of Shia on the eastern side of the Arabian Peninsula. Powerful enough that they go to Mecca, where the Kaaba is, okay, which is the holy site of Islam. That is where the black stone is housed, okay, really, really important relic in Islam, okay? And they steal it. They take the black stone back to their homeland with them, okay? Where the Abbasid dynasty actually has to pay a huge ransom to get it back, okay? So again, even though you have these quite powerful political dynasties, they don't have complete control over the Islamic world, right? So that's something we definitely have to keep in mind, right? Is there is a diversity in Islam, okay? Now, it's during this Umayyad and Abbasid period that you have this political and military expansion of Islam across the Middle East and North Africa in particular, okay? However, that's not the only method of expansion of Islam during this period. You have a kind of a more organic approach too, where you have Arab and Islamic merchants who are plying the Indian Ocean, right, as traders, moving cargo and goods, setting up diaspora communities all over the Indian Ocean, right? If you remember back to our video on the Indian Ocean, the trade in this region is very seasonal, right? It depends on the winds, okay? And if you're a Arab merchant and you sail to the east, you end up in one of these port cities, you've got to wait several months before your return voyage, right? You've got to wait for those winds to shift back to take you home, right? So you end up with these Muslim communities all around the Indian Ocean basin, right? In these very important port cities, you'll have Islamic communities there with mosques and the architecture of Islam, etc., right? So again, you've got these kind of two methods of expansion, right? You've got political, military under Umayyad and Abbasid dynasties, but then you've got that more organic kind of expansion through merchant activity in the Indian Ocean itself, right? Now, the second point we wanted to look at today was, as Islam spreads throughout the world, what else is it bringing with it, right? What other changes can we see besides political and religious change, okay? And this is where we want to note that you have a very large transfer of knowledge and intellectual ideas in the Islamic world, okay? And this really begins at the beginning of the Umayyad dynasty, okay? Under these early Umayyad rulers, you have this emphasis on the acquisition of knowledge, okay? And they're going to set up scholars with very generous pay. Some scholars say on par with professional athletes today, to translate text from the ancient Greek world, for example. These will become quite important to the expansion of knowledge in the Islamic world. Okay? So they'll hire these scholars who are able to translate these Greek texts into Arabic. Okay? And this is pretty interesting because it's not just Arab scholars who are engaged in this. You have Christians and Jews as well who are being hired by these rulers of the Umayyad Empire to transfer these texts. Okay? So what do they do with these Greek texts? Right? What's the purpose? Well, we're talking about science, math, astronomy, etc. Right? So they'll take these ideas and expand on these ideas. Right? And we'll just kind of walk through some of the outcomes of taking this knowledge and kind of running with it. Right? So one of the first things we can look at is, how do you make sure this knowledge is flowing through society, right? Well, you have a common language now, Arabic, and a common script, okay? Which means you can write these things down, right? So they're going to take the idea of paper from China and start to apply that to the Islamic world as well, right? So you end up with a mass production of books, for example, kind of an assembly line system where they are pumping out text for people to read, right? And we should note that in Europe at the same time, this is not really happening, okay? In fact, they're not really using paper in Europe. They're using parchment, which is animal skins, okay? So it's quite difficult to mass produce books in Europe at this time. Whereas in the Islamic world, they figured out how to do this, right? They get this new technology, paper, to make this happen, okay? So when we think about these texts, where do they go, right? Well, now you have the establishment of libraries, colleges, universities, okay? Which are going to obviously attract scholars from different places in the Islamic world as well, okay? Some of these universities are still standing today, right? These are long-standing institutions of learning, right? So one of the first things we'll look at is math, for example, okay? In a previous video, we mentioned the adoption of zero from Indian mathematics. Okay? They're going to use that in the Islamic world, right? So we'll get the development of Arabic numerals, which are going to use the concept of zero. And from that, we get things like algebra, trigonometry, advanced geometry, calculus. Okay? And you can see this in the Islamic world through things like architecture and engineering. In fact, if you go to modern Spain today, you can still see examples of this. Okay, we have a really beautiful mosque in Cordoba, okay, in Spain, and then you also have the Alhambra, which is in Granada in Spain. Okay, both built during this time of what we call the golden age of Islam. Okay, and when you look at these wonderful structures, you can see the application of mathematics in there. Okay, the geometric patterns, etc. Right, really quite remarkable stuff going on here. Okay, now moving on from mathematics, astronomy, very important as well. Okay, they'll take some of these Greek texts and expand upon those too. Okay, now what's the importance of astronomy at this time? Well, a couple of things we can really focus on here. One is the keeping of time. Right, the cosmos is kind of a good way to do that, but also navigation. Right, you're using astronomy for navigation too. Okay? Again, the cosmos is going to let you know where you are in the world. Okay? Along with this, they're going to use the astrolabe from the Greeks, which is a navigational device, as well as the Chinese compass, right? And this will help to expand some of these trade routes in the Indian Ocean and really just kind of let you know where you're at, right? So again, when we think about expansion through merchant activity, you've got to have the knowledge to be able to do that, correct? Okay? Now, moving on to biology, for example, okay? Again, we're going to take some of this old Greek knowledge and expand on what they had already learned and figured out, right? And you end up with some really interesting stuff happening in the Islamic world in terms of biology, okay? There are textbooks written about biology, and they're figuring this information out basically through autopsies and dissections, right? Where you can figure out all the systems of the human body, right? The circulatory system, cardiovascular system, the muscular system, the skeletal system, all of these things are being explored by Islamic physicians, right? In fact, you're having textbooks written about this, right? And there's a huge volume, 30-volume encyclopedia that's put out that basically goes through all of this knowledge that they've gathered on medicine, right? Even down to the tools that are used for surgery, right? And then how to do surgery with those tools, right? And they're doing some pretty advanced stuff, right? Things like cauterization, right? Amputations, things that aren't necessarily happening in Europe at this time. Europe, you still have this focus on what they would call the humors, right? And in the Islamic world, they pretty much dismiss that, right? As they've explored how biology actually functions, right? Now, in the field of biology, we can think about things like human evolution, right? How did we get the form that we have, right? Where do we come from? And interestingly enough, Islamic thinkers at this time are pointing to what people like Darwin will point to several hundred years later, right? They're saying, it looks like the human form, our species, may be related to other primates, right? So they're kind of making that connection there. Several hundred years before Europeans are doing this, okay? So, as you look at all of these, this gathering of knowledge, how they apply it and how they expand upon it, we can really see how they're picking up what was happening in this European classical world of Greece and some of these Roman ideas too, and preserving it, right? And kind of taking it to the next level, okay? And like I mentioned, Europe is not doing this at this point, right? It's going to be several hundred years before they go through this on their own. And they're not going to be able to do it without the Islamic world doing it first, okay? You'll see Latin translations of these Arabic texts. For example, the 30-volume encyclopedia on medicine will become a textbook in European universities to train doctors in medicine, okay? So I think it's very important to note that the Islamic world during this time is a bridge between that classical period of European history, the Greeks and the Romans, and what will become known as, the scientific revolution and the age of enlightenment in Europe, right? It's really important to note that the Europeans are reliant on these ideas that the Muslim world has saved from the Greeks and expanded upon. Okay? You don't really get the Age of Exploration. You don't really get the Renaissance. You don't get the scientific revolution in Europe without this happening first. Okay? And that often goes unacknowledged in European history. Okay? So quite important to kind of fill that gap in there, right? Of how does Europe start to pick up these ideas again? Okay? And again, a lot of this is going to come out of this age of information during this golden age of Islam. Right? Now, that basically brings us up to the 1200s. Okay, so in our next video, what we'll do is look at more about what was happening in that later period of Islam. Okay, because what was going to happen is we're going to have Mongol invasions come in. That's going to disrupt the system, the political system in the Islamic world. Okay, so our next video, we'll take a little bit of a deeper dive into the political world of Islam after the fall of the Abbasid Empire as the Mongols roll in. Okay? All right, so thanks for watching, everybody. Please share, please subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Hey, you. Thanks for watching World History for You. Please subscribe and share with your friends. We'll see you next time.